let's quickly get into today's. So we're going to look at event-driven programming today. We're going to look at timers, and then we're going to get into modifying CSS with JavaScript. So last week, we looked at modifying HTML elements with JavaScript. This week, we're going to look at doing CSS. So a lot of you came from CSS, HTML class just a few weeks ago. We did not really go through some of the specifics regarding how to programmatically alter CSS. So we're going to look at that today. It's one of the topics. We're going to look at form, and I think I have form in the other class, but not enough. So we're going to look at the standard form validation. Form is your login page, registration page, anything that requires you to enter something and hit submit. That is what we call form. Form is a collection of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all together. Okay. Well, some forms don't have a CSS. That would be kind of dumb, like a dummy page with really no, UX. So let's see with it. All right, and let's start. We're going to look at JavaScript Object Notations. So let's quickly look at our learning objectives today. Give me a second. I think this link works. Yeah, so we're going to look at event-driven programming. We're going to look at timer, modification of CSS using JavaScript, form validation, and JSON. So please go through these. And if you see any of those as, hey, professor, this topic is not mentioned, let me know right away, because I think they do, but sometimes there might be additional information that I missed from time to time. Okay, so you should be able to. So if you look at this entire thing, right? It's all about understanding stuff, learning stuff, exploring stuff, and understanding, right? It's kind of like a loop, right? And some of the understanding and explore and learn requires that you go through lab assignments, okay? So it's like coding. And whenever you get through challenge activity, I wish this book has a lot of that, because that's where you get to code something, you know what I mean? More and more to really try to memorialize these concepts rather than memorizing them. There's two different. Memorializing concept means you're doing enough times where you gain that muscle memory, kind of like gymnasts, right? In a gym, and they just keep on doing the same routines after, like for years, and eventually they can just do it in their sleep, right? Literally. And it's kind of the same thing with programming as well. So I want you to continuously just go back and forth on the participation activity, challenge activities, and reading to gain that memorization, because that's where the learning kind of takes off. Because in programming, you kind of have to associate a lot of different concepts and try to bridge them in a very abstract way. This is different than memorize something from organic chemistry, biology, you know what I mean? So some of the like humanity classes where you commit rote memorizations to learn something, or like history class, but programming is totally different. Okay, anyway, we're going to get into more applied use cases when you get into like the next level JavaScript framework class. Okay, any questions about your learning objectives for this week? Yeah, if not, this is your reading assignment. You're responsible for 7.4 through 7.8. And this is the reflection of what you see in your homework assignment. When you get into it, you got to answer every single one of them, okay? To maximize your point. So to that extent, let's take a look. Yeah, and please, I used to have these links where you can click on this link to get into it, but this is not going to get you linked to your homework assignment. So the only way to directly get into your Zybook and make sure that your Zybook is connected to this canvas where the grades could be automatically uploaded is go through the assignment. You have to go back to the modules and just pick any assignments. Like if you want to do this for this week, you'll click into it and then scroll all the way down, right? There's a link there where you'll get taken into another page. This is on a test student. I don't have an account in Zybo, but you get the point. You'll actually be taken into that, and then that's where you establish that link. And some of you had troubles uploading points. If this happens to you, just ping me and let me know whether, one, if you submit your work on time. If you submit your work late, There's no way for Zybook to submit what was done late, past the due date, you know what I mean, into Canvas. So you'll just be getting whatever points that you had before that due date. Let's say the due date is end of day today, and you submit it tomorrow. Yeah, those net new points will not be reflected on Canvas for that reason. But sometimes if you submit things on time and scores still don't show up, just ping me, okay? I'll look into the system. Zybook actually keeps track of all of the submissions, and it's like a history of all of the activities that each student's had. So I'm able to kind of look into it and see if this is a mistake and to resolve it. Okay, any questions so far? All right, and let's get into it. So today we're gonna, this is my view. All right, let's get into JavaScript in the browser. I'm not gonna go back to the more DOM modifications, so please do spend some time on this one. This one is a little more involved, but let's jump straight to event-driven programming. So it turns out that JavaScript handles events. So event is a generic thing, isn't actually an object in JavaScript where you're able to encapsulate an action. So something happens asynchronously on a browser, for example, is an event. And this entire event object, which is a JavaScript object, has a whole bunch of metadata or attributes associated with this event. Like if this event is a mouse event, it will capture where the mouse was at, right? The moment that this event was triggered in terms of the X and Y coordinates. Does it make sense? So like you can look at your entire browser as a canvas, right? There's an X and Y coordinates. So when you move your mouse, the X and Y coordinate actually changes. So this is one type of the attribute that gets captured in, so this is your browser. And here is a 0 and 0, right? And then let's say this 300 by 300. So if you place your mouse cursor over here, this might be 150, 120. So this thing gets captured inside an event object called mouse event. Okay. So in general, there's lots of different kinds of events and types, and we'll look at that later on. But generically, let's just look at this entire event as an object that encapsulates a lot of information about what just happened on the browser asynchronously, okay? Or something that gets generated natively, like your timer, which gets triggered every second to ping the second hand, right? As the timer moves through the entire, timings event. So the event-driven programming means that this entire program is for driving these events to effectuate something, and that is what we call UX, user interactions. These things could be in the form of animations, or it could be in the form of, let's say, a marquee that pans through the top portion of your stock ticker going from left to right, or something disappears or something pops up. Yeah, these are various different types of animations or events that gets triggered. And event-driven programming basically enables that kind of, user interactions. So this is some people call it programming style. Yes, it is, because it commands the registration of the event, the propagation of the event, and also, how you start, stop, and pause events. So there's a style, there's a paradigm that you have to know in order to get this to work. Does it make sense? So the event-driven programming in JavaScript is slightly different than some of the event-driven programming that you see in C++, Java. So every programming language has its own way of enabling this thing. But by and large, you can kind of see most of the stuff that you see in JavaScript, they came from OOP language. By the way, JavaScript has nothing to do with Java. Okay, they are two different things. So this Java portion of the script is not Java, but they share, I would say, like 80%, 90% syntax. So they're kind of related to each other, but then they're not. They're different. So anyway, you'll see event-driven programming. JavaScript is one type of event-driven programming, scripting language or programming language, whichever way you prefer to call it, where you're able to use JavaScript code to run some events and by triggering them, right, when something happens on the screen. Okay, so that's what called event-driven programming. Any questions about this? All right, so when you get into event-driven programming, you have what's called event handler or event listener. So you can kind of think of this whole event handler and listener as some sort of registry. Okay, so there is a registry. You guys know what a registry is? Yeah, I mean, in a broader sense of the term, registry means that you put some people's name and then some information about them, right? So like there's a name, like baby registry, fine. You can say, hey, this is what I want, and then you put your name tied to it. So like people know who this registry gift, came from. So you have name and then gift. But in an event registry, what you have is event handler, which is the name. They call it handler, okay? So handler is actually a name of that event. And then you can register, event. Let's say event 1, event 2, event 3, right, to these handler. Usually it's one by one. Like one handler would be listening to one type of event. You don't have multiple events, getting belonging to the same event listener. Usually it's one-on-one. So this is what happens when you have something that is registered or this event called mouse event. Then whatever this mouse event gets detected by your browser, this event handler, which is the name of the function, okay, then does something. And whatever this event function does is what you specify it to do. Does it make sense? And so you can specify this event handler or this method to, hey, produce this animation when mouse focuses on this particular element inside the HTML. So that's one example of how you can use JavaScript to trigger events. Okay, but you have to first establish a handler. You have to set up a listener and make sure that it captures the right type of event category to begin with. Okay, all right. If this is not abstract enough, and I will try to debunk the myth. Let me see if I can just show you some animation to clarify a couple of things. Okay, so I really like these animations because first of all, you can do this at your own pace. And I know I started one, but let's look at what's going on here. So this particular example shows two pieces. One of them is HTML. Okay, there's no CSS, okay? So the blue one is your HTML and the orange one is your JavaScript. So JavaScript here, okay? And then this is your HTML. All right, if you look at the whole HTML, there is two paragraphs, right? So basically name and answer each occupies a P element. It's a P tag. And this is an input box. It's got a label. Label is non-modifiable text. And your input is whatever you can. So this input is a text area, right? So it is a text box, okay? All right, and this outer stuff is, don't care about that. That's just your browser. And you have some JavaScript that says, hey, when you mouse over, and this is your mouse, by the way, mouse cursor, okay? So in this example, we're going to use our mouse as the event trigger to effectuate some UX, okay? And this UX depends on what you have here, right? This is a load of stuff here. So let's look at the very first line of the code. It says, let's use document query selector all. So this is a way of gathering all of the inputs, essentially creating an array with, I don't know, there could be 4, 5, 6 inputs out there. But in this case, there's only 2 inputs, right? So he's going to create, this is index 0, index 1. So there is a inputs, plural, array that stores the entire input object. Okay, so you have input 1, and then you have input 2, right? Whatever this is called in memory, stored inside of it. And that's what this inputs is talking about. Now this inputs has 2 elements inside. So you do a for loop there and say, hey, let me get each input object, which is this and this. For each of this, you want to set that input style border, and then you want to add a listener. Okay, add event listener. This event listener takes 2 things. So add event listener takes two things. One of them is the name, right, of event. So there could be multiple events like focus event, blur event, and things like that. That's parameters number one. Parameters number two is the method. Okay, that gets triggered. Invocation methods. So this invocation method is what's gonna, basically effectuate that UX. Does it make sense? And then you actually have two of these, right? Depending on what this is. So in general, there's, I don't know, I would say maybe like a dozen different different event type out there. So focus means that whenever you mouse over, like you can see my mouse right here, right? My mouse is doing this right now. So this is what we call focus. When you place your cursor on some sort of object, that object gets the focus. Okay, focus event. Now, as soon as your mouse leaves that focus area, let's say, this box right here. Now, if my cursor is on this box in this red area right here, then I generate what's called focus event. Okay, mouse focus. And as soon as I leave or move my cursor away from this red box right here, that's what we call blur. Okay, so these are the definitions. You don't have to memorize this, but just in general have some sort of idea on what it is these things are doing. So as you can see, there are two events. One is the focus event and the other one is blur event. And they've been added through that listener, for the object. So this object inherently has the idea of what needs to do or what needs to be done as soon as the focus happens or as soon as the blur happens. Does it make sense? So this is kind of the context behind what this entire lab is really about. So let's look at what happens here. If I were to rerun this, step number one. All right, so what just happened? I just mouse, right? So if you look this carefully, I mouse over the text area. So this text area has already been extracted earlier with a listener called focus tied to it. And this focus, as soon as it is triggered, invokes this function, which changes this dot step. By the way, this means the pointer, right? This is that input you're talking about. This style dot border gets changed to a green. Okay, 1 pixels solid green. So this is what happened. Let's do this again. When you mouse over this input box, this thing gets triggered and it sets your border to have a green color. Okay, let's do this again. Mouse over, boom. And the reason why this happens is because you're in focus. All right, so let's do the second animation. The user then has the focus of the box and types other dent. Okay, so the user actually typed this in. Now, typing this in doesn't remove that focus. Why? Well, because your mouse is still out on that object, right? There's no out of focus, right? It's still focused. So typing your text into it doesn't trigger any of these animations. Make sense? So all what this for loop is doing is to register these two events to their respective inputs. Okay, object. Typing your your name or whatever is inside this text area doesn't trigger anything at all. Okay, so that's number two. Number three, now this is very tricky. What just happened? I move my cursor away, right, from the original box. So what that is going to do is I'm going to trigger what's called blur, right? So as soon as I leave my cursor, that blur event is called. Make sense? And that blur event says, if this happens, then change my boundary to blue. So if I do this again from scratch, I just left that area and it'll trigger a blur. This blur changed my boundary to blue. Make sense? That's number one. And number two, now because I'm on the second input, and this second input also has both focus and blur, right? So now that I'm on the second object, this object now is in focus, which gets what's called green, right? Because focus event object is called through this listener. And because this listener registered this event with this function changes the boundary green. Now I get this green one. So let's just look at this again. I leave my name, focus on the answer. So name becomes blue boundary wise, and answer becomes green boundary wise. Does it make sense so far? Okay, so I'm going to do something again. Number 4, I'm going to type something, and typing something in this has no registry whatsoever. So you can just type it along. Your UX is not going to change. So far, so good. Make sense? All right, number 5. Number 5 is I'm going to leave the answer area, and that causes a blur, right? Blur event. This blur event says, oh, I gotta evoke this function that changes the boundary to blue. So as soon as you leave your cursor, you remove your cursor away from the second box, this box changes color to blue. Okay, it's boundary to blue. Right? Any questions about this entire animations in general?
Yes. So I'm sorry, I missed the part about the for loop. I was wondering why that was needed, or when does it get called?
Yeah, the for loop is simply just to glue the event associated. So you have 2 input. Okay, input number 1 and input number 2. So you get all of them through query select all. This is JavaScript methods that is part of your document objects in DOM. And this puts this input and this input into an array. Okay, this array index 0 and 1. So your input number 1 sits right here. Your input number 2 sits right here. These are input objects. Okay, it's an object in JavaScript. So this entire for loop basically says I want to glue my event to this object. So there are 2 events I want to blur. One that I want to glue this to. One is the focus, one is the blur. And focus carries a function, and blur also carries a function with it. So this entire bridge or glue is established through this for loop right here. And same thing with my input object number 2, where I want to enact or glue my focus event with a function that gets called when this focus event is in place, as well as a blur event tying to another method function. So this is a function, this is a function prime. So these are not the same function, okay? This is a function prime. Maybe I should call it function double prime and triple prime to basically says these are different functions. But these are functions are defined here. Okay. So this is what we called event registry. Okay, so you register these events to the each of the inputs. Okay, and you use a for loop there to kind of loop through it. So at the end of this entire for loop, 4 events gets registered. 2 of them register to event input number 1. Okay, and 2 of them register to input number 2. So this means when users start to move, mouses around, depending on which input we're talking about. So these inputs are text areas, okay, because we call it right here. One of them is the name input, and the second one is the answer input. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions about this? All right. So this is a very straightforward event-driven programming example. Okay. There's a lot more very complicated ones. Don't worry about those yet. I don't think you'd be confused if you just stay on a high level. So let's look at some of the other things like changes, input, load, document load, focus, blur. Yeah, so we talked about focus and blur, right? So focus event is caused when the element becomes current receiver of keyboard input. This can also be your mouse. So keyboard input means mouse. It's the same, right? External device. Blur means whenever this keyboard input, kind of moves away from the focus area. So these events are tied to JavaScript objects. And you can also do submit. This submit causes the form to be submitted, and information will be transmitted through the web server via HTTP. You also have add event listener. So these are all what we called objects or properties, or you can call them functions. So add event listener is actually a function that register event. Register means gluing, okay? Gluing, tying the event handler to something. And add event listener is part of the document object. So this is definitely Java. So all of those are browser specific JavaScripts. Okay. So we already talked about what an event object is. We talked about submit and focus. So there's document content loaded. So this is more of an event that is fired from your HTML DOM model when it knows that the entire DOM, like the entire DOM could be a tree. It is a tree. When the entire tree gets rendered, this is when the entire DOM models in the back fires this document content loaded. Loaded as in, I'm done loading the content. So you have this signal. Sometimes you want the entire page to be loaded before you start playing some, soundbite, right? In that case, you want to use document content loaded trigger to, capture the end of your, rendering to do something else. There's also change event, input event. So this input event is the one that I was talking about, right? Like right here, okay? A load event is when a browser loading a resource at event. So this is, there is a beginning load or ending load. When you start to load something, this is when that event gets fired. So it gets very intricate when you start to manipulate these events. You want to capture the right event type and then say, hey, when this event, gets triggered, what do I want to do, right? So you write a function next to it. So this function is what we call anonymous function, right? So we talked about this. This anonymous function is kind of like a function expression that, or you can actually make this into an arrow function if you like. So they don't have names, but these are nonetheless function, which is an object. So just remember, function is an object in JavaScript, okay? Any questions so far? Yeah, I think it helps to look at another example. So before we look into this, what we have here is, by the way, blue stands for HTML in the context of Zybook. So you see this entire HTML, but it's got what's called embedded or inlined JavaScript inside of it. So the embedded portion is this, right? Actually, let me change the color of this marker. This is your JS, your JavaScript from here to here. And then there's got two functions in it. There is a window dot add version. Okay, so technically you can put this window is that outer, is this guy right here. Okay, and sometimes we call them, like, windows and documents are different. Okay, so this document references that whole DOM object. Okay, that represents this area right here. Okay, so that's kind of a document. Now, when you get into window is that entire browser, basically, that black line right here. Okay. So in this case, I want my entire window to listen for DOM content loaded, which means if my window detects that all of the entire DOM tree, this is a tree, DOM tree gets loaded, then I want to do something like this. I want to load handler. So this load handler is actually a method. In this case, you can take them outside. You don't have to do them anonymously. You can create a standalone function that says, hey, I want to do this, right? As long as this guy is loaded. You also have key up handler, which is embedded in another text handler event that is sitting inside of the load handler. So you can kind of think of this entire DOM tree, right, that gets loaded or rendered. When the entire rendering is done, it triggers this load handler, which has another event registered to it. In other words, you will first render this whole thing and said later on, when I mouse, like for example, I mouse over maybe this area, then I want to change something. So you can have this and this whole nested event inside another event. But these are asynchronous events that will happen in the future. They don't just happen right away, right? This means blocking. They're not blocking. They basically register this event and say, hey, in the near future, if you were to do something, if the user were to do something that triggers this particular type of event that is glue, right, to this JavaScript or DOM object, then I want, A, B, and C to be executed. Whatever is this A, B, and C will be inside that anonymous function we talked about earlier, like load handler. Okay, so these functions are what you define. You have total power to do whatever you need to do in this, and this is how we, as a front-end developers, do things. You specify what you need done. Okay, and so this is a quick snippet showing how JavaScript can be embedded inside the HTML to give you event handling. Okay, so let's quickly look at the animations to see what's going on. All right, so I'm going to start, and there's a couple of frames. The very first frame is, I'm going to add listener. So adding a listener doesn't mean that anything is triggered. So there's no triggering. This simply just say, hey, put this on the registry. Let me, let's tie this into a synchronous event that happens in the future. So the very first thing doesn't do anything. So remember, when this entire page, right, this entire HTML page gets loaded, your JavaScript interpreter or your browser starts with top-down approach, right? Your browser is not going to look at, this entire text from bottom to top. It started from top to bottom and left to right, right? So the very first thing that comes to mind, aside from the title and so, right, is your window add listener. So this is where your inline JavaScript gets loaded as soon as the content is getting loaded. So they're basically loading each other at the same time, right? Meanwhile, your HTML is not done yet because right now you're still interpreting this JavaScript, right? While your entire browser is still kind of reading this body, label, input, whatever. So both are done kind of at the same time or on a separate thread. Okay, separate threads. They're not blocking each other. So there is a loading of HTML and loading of JavaScript pretty much at the same time, okay? And I would say loading of HTML starts first from here, and then maybe like 2 milliseconds into it, it comes across this JavaScript, and that's when JavaScript starts to load, and while JavaScript is loading from here to here, which takes delta maybe 5 milliseconds, your entire, like from 2 seconds and on, jumps into the next one. This is where the body, which gets, maybe another delta, 3 milliseconds or something. So meanwhile, this thing is still executing, right? Completing this entire rendering. Your JavaScript is also loading kind of behind the scene. Okay? Make sense? All right, so there's a load of background info. Let's look at what's going on here. So the second step says, after the rest of the HTML is loaded and parsed, the DOM content loaded event occurs and loaded handler is called. Okay, so what happens is this entire thing gets registered, and boom, what happens is your DOM content loaded is fired. By who? By your window, right? Your window, is like the shell that contains that entire DOM. That entire DOM is loaded. Your window knows what's going on and throws the DOM content loaded signal, right, at the event listener registry. And event listener registry sees, oh, this is the right signal. If I get this signal, I must invoke this loaded handler, which is a function. And that's what happens. Okay, this content, which is just a name in the box, gets loaded, boom. Now this loaded handler is called. And this load handler is going to register another event called key up. So what is key up? Well, key up means this, okay? So when you type something in a name box, right? Each time you type in a character, what happens? You depress the button, right? To get the character out, right? And then what do? You lift your finger, right? Now entire button goes up. That's key up, okay? So when you type something, the moment that you enter stuff, try while you're depressing the button, right? Your keyboard button, that's key down. And then the moment that you lift your finger after completing the entry of a character on the screen, you do key up, right? So each character entry calls for a pair of key down up. Make sense? So if you type in like 3 characters, there's key down, key up for the first character, key down, key up for the second character, key down, right? Make sense? So keeps key down, up, down, up, down, up, right? Like this. So what I want to do is for key up, I want to do, I want to invoke this function called key handler. So then again, you see this key handler is right here. So if I go down to the next one, this key handler, oh, by the way, this is what I do my key entry, okay, my key entry. So number 4 is key entry. I type in P, and this P calls for key down, and then key up. As soon as key up is detected, what happens? Your key up handler gets called, right? And by the way, every time this event handler gets called, what happens? It passes an event, right? So this is very different from your object-oriented programming. Professor, where is this event argument? Like, where's this coming from, right? You didn't call right here, right? So this is kind of against, the standard OOP, like where you invoke a function, you supply the function with the argument. But how come this argument is not like, how come there's a parameter, but you don't have arguments here? Well, you can trust that your browser is the one that inserts this event. So there is that invisible thing that shows up, as part of this handler, because we need to specify what this event is. So this is the idiosyncrasy I was talking about, where event-driven programming is a style, right? It's a paradigm. It's unlike some of the traditional OOP language where you invoke a function, you pass in an argument, and the argument must be a part of that function's parameter list, right? But there's no such thing in this style of programming. Like, you have to trust that whole event is already there for you. So when you define your event, in other words, when this loaded handler gets called, there's actually events here. So this is what's confusing, okay? But I can tell you right now, there is a invisible event here, okay? You can actually put this event in there, but you don't really use it here, right? So if you don't use it, don't put it. That's what this style is. But if you wish to use it, you can supply it, by having this events here. In other, just so you know that this event, a lot of time people write them as EVT, or you can call it A or B or X. It doesn't matter. But nobody does this, even though it could be any name. We choose to use something that is very intuitive. Okay, so putting events here is fine, or you can write EVT. Okay, in that case, this becomes that object. In this case, it will become evt.key. So basically, what happens is number 4 here captures that whole key up event and which gets fired. Okay, so let's look at what happens next. All right, so what happens next is as soon as you type in this P, it triggers this key event handler with the event that goes in there. And this says if event.key is enter, which P is not enter, right? There's no enter. Then what happens is your if gets bypassed, right? This is a conditional statement, does not state true. So there's nothing after that, and then done. Right, so basically your event went into this event handler that gets evaporated, right? Nothing accomplished. Make sense so far? Any questions so far?
So that event parameter that shows up, that's kind of like the catch statement, how you get the exception, like variable that shows up without defining it, right? In the key up handler, that event that you talked about, it just shows up, right?
This event is supplied in all of the event handler, but sometimes the programmer decide not to use it. So technically there is an event here. If you don't use it, you don't need it. You can just you don't have to put it inside. But this event is used in this clause. So the author of this program snippet put it in like this. technically, as a good practice, you would include it regardless of whether you want to use it or not. You actually write EVT in here as a parameter. Yeah, and some people use event. Okay. All right. So now there's no enter, right? So this thing just don't do anything. Next one. I'm going to keep typing. Again, when I enter something that is not really a enter, right? By the way, enter is a character, but eventually I enter. So if I do enter this entire key up, right? As soon as my enter key is released, is key up invokes this key up handler with an event that says, hey, this is an enter event. This enter is, what just happened. Then do something. Okay, so this do something basically says number 7. All right. Text box is event.target, and then you do the alert. So this alert is a pop-up modal, JavaScript pop-up modal on your browser. And it's not part of the browser. It's literally a pop-up modal. And in this case, it was indicated by the, this gray modal. And it'll show up and say, hey, hello. And actually, it didn't say hey. It says hello with a space, text box value, right? Whatever that is, period. So this entire text box dot value is event.targets. So when I said when something gets triggered, this thing is called event. This entire event has a target, and this entire target is whatever is inside that event in text. Okay, usually it's in HTML text. So that's why you say event target. As soon as this enter is detected, it'll go into that text box, which is represented by event.target, which will capture basically the whole thing. Yeah, the whole thing without the enter. And that whole thing without enter is this text box dot value. So it's kind of convoluted. You can actually write this as event target dot value. So a lot of times in JavaScript, you see people write event target value. So that's essentially what this interaction is letting you do. I think the author decided to put them in the 2 lines of code, but technically you can event.target.value, just get the whole thing out. Okay. So yeah, this is something that you may want to memorize. There's a few things you want to know is event.target.value gives you whatever is inside that box. Okay, assuming that whole event represents a text area. Make sense? So sometimes you have a button. Now that button doesn't really have an event.target.value, right? Because that's not something that user enters. So there's these things that gets predefined like years ago, like 20, 30 years ago. People don't change it. Like students always ask me, like, Professor, can I just do event.user.value? Wouldn't this be more intuitive? I tell you right now, yes, but that was not what was in this API. Yeah, they use target. Okay, makes sense? All right, so any questions about this PA? All right, I chose to spend a little more time on this, especially on the the first couple of PAs, because event-driven programming is not easy. A lot of times it's kind of against intuition if you think about this, and there is this very intricate and different set of convention that you have to follow, right, in order to get it. Yeah, if you miss that convention and you just take it for granted, you'll be more and more confused as time goes on, right? When we start looking into this, so you got to get those foundations correct. Okay, so I hope this gives you that foundation you need to understand more about event-driven programming in JavaScript. All right, cool.
Professor, what does that pound sign next to name mean up in the query selector function call? There, that line.
Oh, you mean upstairs?
Right there. No, to the right. Where it says name. Pound name.
Oh wait, hold on a second.
Well, you're up like 2 more lines up. There, the document.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
So yeah, pound means ID.
Oh,
Hold on a second. Yeah, pound means ID, and
I
dot
see a dot. Yeah.
means class.
Oh,
Yeah,
I see.
this is a JavaScript and CSS conventions. So yeah, when you have elements like this, and then there's an ID elements attribute, sorry, and then they could be a class. The difference between class and ID is ID must be unique. Class doesn't have to be unique. Yeah, and then yeah, if this is number sign, you can associate a number sign with the ID. So there's most likely this ID name, and class. There's no specification of class here, so maybe there's no class. Usually you don't have a class and ID together. You have one or either. So ID ensures that that whole element is unique. So you cannot have another P, for example, with ID name elsewhere. So when it comes to JavaScript, it's pretty safe. When you said there's pound name, this name is got to be very unique. If this name is not unique, meaning you have another P with an ID name, your HTML is going to throw up in with errors. Okay, and yeah, this is the reason why you can. I guarantee for this particular name, since you're using an ID, there's only one in return. So there's only one text box associated with this. Yeah, that's kind of the convention. Any other questions? All right, let's see. Well, it took us shy of 1 hour to get to this much. I doubt how much we could get to it, but I would definitely want you to go through this. This is a very good exercise that calls for modification of HTML, JavaScript, CSS. Yeah, spend some time. You'll definitely figure this out. This is not tough. It just takes time to get acquainted, right, with the events. All right. So here's the kind of not a lot of front-end developers go through these, but this helps understand how this event-driven, this whole paradigm works in the context of HTML. So inside HTML, we have DOM tree, right? This document object model tree from the root to events. So this is what's called event capturing. When doing the event capturing, which is the initial phase of it, if you look at this entire event triggering, all that stuff, yeah, they happens in 3 phases. One of them is event capturing. Second phase is at target, and the third one is event bubbling. So these are 3 series of events that happens in sequence. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. Okay, so phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Event capturing means you're capturing something, and let's say if this something is, this is your DOM tree, by the way, and let's say if this thing happens here, right? There is a focus on this li object, okay, and it happens here. So what happens is this event capturing phase, the browser traverses the DOM tree from roots, okay, from here to here. So that whole traversals happen from your roots to that target. So that's what's called event capturing. At target means that your entire execution is already at this level. This is at target. This is at target. Okay, at target means you're dead on. You're on this focus line. Event bubbling means going back to the root. Okay, so there is a top down, and at target means you're staying there, and then bottom up. Okay, this entire thing is going around, from root to target, and then basically back. Make sense? So this is whole event-driven sequence. This is definitely very abstract, so let's look at animations here to gain some understanding of the context behind it. Let's take a look. So there are 7 frames. This is the entire HTML. Your entire HTML is organized in this blue and green. So your HTML has a body has a p tag. P tag has what? Each line item, right? Li. Right. So this is kind of like what you see in blue right here is kind of captured in this, like in the 2-dimensional tree right here. Okay. And then you have this orange JavaScript that complements it. So let's look at the frame number 1. You have this mouse. Your mouse is mousing over what? The very first li, right? So the very first li is this guy right here, right? So which means that this li right here, this one, as I mouse over it, is the one that gets target, right? The target. So let's look at the animations here. So as soon as this happens, your execution, right? Event execution, right? There's a separate thread, right? As soon as you mouse over that one, you get a focus event. This asynchronous thread. Thread is a separate software unit that executes something asynchronously, right? It's not really blocking your current workflow. You can think of it as a worker, software worker in the back doing this. And so that worker traverses from HTML, which is the root, all the way down to the target, which is OL. So that entire thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, oh, I'm sorry, 1, 2, and 3 happens right here. So what is OL? Ordered list, right? This entire, this entire 1, 2, and 3 is encapsulated inside an ordered list. So that ordered list is the one that is being focused on right now, right? And then what happens next is you are at the face target. Your target is the li element inside the OL, right? The order list, there is the line item. This is the very first line item, which is the one that you just focused on, is the one that is being focused and caught at target, right? So you can think of this entire, like the software worker constantly working, the DOM tree trying to traverse, as depending on where the mouse is. So there's a lot of workers listening and trying to do something behind the scene that you don't know as an ordinary user, but now you're learning JavaScript, you're learning HTML, CSS, you know what's going on behind the scene, right? So it's pretty interesting. So next up, we have what's called face bobbling, right? This face bobbling kind of goes back up, and as it goes back up, it checks to see, hey, if there is any event that gets, fired, because when you have mouse over, so when you mouse over this, which is the same as focus, right? Sometimes these events are interchangeable. So mouse over means when you mouse over this particular li, this li then changes color to red. In this case, I want to change my event dot. Sometimes people use E, by the way. Sometimes people use EVT. Sometimes people just write out the whole thing. E is just a shorthand way of writing that event. So notice that this function also carries the events here, right? That you didn't see before. But I can tell you right now, every time we're dealing with event-driven programming, you always include the event object, okay? But you can also not to include it. This is really weird about, or peculiar about JavaScript, is even if you don't include it, it kind of violates the, the function definitions, right? But JavaScript is pretty lax about these things. So even if you don't have this E right here, it's okay, it'll work, but then you won't be able to call E.target.style. So you must pass it in, right, at the beginning of the function. This basically changed the whole line to red. Okay, let's look at the next animations here. Now I'm going to move my mouse away from this red. Again, this goes into capturing, which stops right there and says, yeah, if you have a mouse out means blur, basically blur. Then I want to change this entire target style down to black, right? Makes sense? And boom, this is checked. But this must go back, right? So I target. Okay, so I target. You're basically back to where it was triggered. So mouse out happens from this target, even though your mouse is elsewhere now. It goes back to the target, and the next up is to bubble back up. Okay, as you start to bubble back up, there's really nothing that's captured that is glued to any of these, right? Because you already did the mouse out. There's nothing left. So your event kind of just visit every single node and see, hey, if there's any event associated with that node, oh, there's none, let's go back. eventually this entire execution goes back to HTML, which is the root. Then your entire sort of event bubbling and triggering bubbling, this entire life cycle of event ends. Okay. So you can kind of imagine, right? Every time you do something, like even when I just change this entire mouse from one side to the other, there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scene. Okay. It triggers what's called the event capturing, target, and then bubbling back up. This whole action is the entire event cycle, like from time 0 all the way to time, I don't know, 1 millisecond. That entire life cycle encompasses 3 phases, right? And along the way, when these events get into that particular phase, it will look into some of the registered event that is tied to it and start to execute it asynchronously, right? Sometimes you can see and the whole animation started to happen when you mouse over something, or sometimes you can see, oh, the entire text or background change colors when you mouse over it. When you leave that area, maybe something else happens. So there's a lot of things you can do with JavaScript on top of HTML and CSS. So there's what's called stop propagation and prevent default. These are very commonly used JavaScript methods that is part of your documents or windows. Stop propagation means, remember the bubbling, right? The capturing, bubbling. Don't do any of that, right? You basically says don't propagate any of these, and it'll stop. Okay, so this will force the default or the native propagation and said don't do anything there. We stop right there. Now, prevent default means stops the browser from performing the built-in handler. So there is a certain default actions associated with some of these. I don't, on top of my head, I think, let's say if when you press the button is supposed to be, you say this UX effect that gets raised. There's some default UX that you don't want to, show. In that case, you say default, prevent defaults. This happens a lot when you have some sort of asynchronous event like a timer, and this timer will fire, this event, and then all of a sudden, this entire thing gets changed to a certain color, but it goes back to the default color. In that case, you want to prevent defaults. So there are things about some of the use cases associated with this prevent default and stop propagations. I would ask you to go through the event programming. Let me see if there is a reference. I think there is. Yeah, if not, then it's probably in the next sections. All the way on the bottom. Jeez. I think. Yeah, let me exit. Yeah, so in your text, digital text, there's one from MDN and there's one from Java2S. W3 School also has a pretty rich sections on that part where they talked about specific use cases associated with your prevent default behaviors and stop propagations. Okay. Anyway, so there's more to the read. Let me get back to the presentation view because it's more succinct. This is more of the PowerPoint slides. All right. Let's move on to timer. Any questions so far? All right, so it turns out that you can create a timer. So timer is useful in, clocking certain animation to have certain things fire at certain intervals. You can do timeout. You can also set intervals. So set intervals more about enabling some sort of animation that happens, repeatedly until you say you're done. This is kind of a repeated thing. Whereas set timeout happens only once because you can associate it with a set timeout with a function only. Okay, there's only one function, and that whole function doesn't really repeat, right? So it's like a one-off thing. But when you set interval, this entire timer will continuously fire behind the scene. So let's quickly look at this entire animation from scratch. So you have a piece of HTML and some JavaScript next to it, CSS. So what happens is this entire HTML has an ID tag associated with a div. This ID is special. And so in CSS, you would write number sign, okay? Numbers ID. So this number special is going to have display none, this border, so on and so forth. So that's what you see. What you see is what you get. All right, now we're going to insert JavaScript in green. This entire JavaScript says, I'm going to set the entire timeout for this whole piece, right? This entire window. So 3000 means 300 milliseconds. So 3000 milliseconds means 30 seconds. Actually, no, 3 seconds. Okay, so what you have is 3000, and after 3000 expires, the 3 seconds expires, call this special. So technically there's an event inside of here, but we don't use events. What I want to do is I want to call special, like get elements by ID, and I want to set that entire special style to block. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens. So after 3 seconds, right, the timer goes down. This show special gets called, and then I'm gonna have a block. So you guys know what a display block, right? To find HTML, CSS, it creates a block to encapsulate that entire special that says this. Okay, today only to HTML. This is all specified from here. Right. So this is kind of a dynamic thing that happens, and of course you can use set timeout to create a timer to create a clock, right? And you can see the, like the minute hands and also the second hands start to move. So this is all doable with this timer, minus the UX, because you have to draw a clock, and I don't know how to draw it. You can have some animations, some images, whatever. All right, so the next example is set interval. So let's look at this whole animation, starting from your HTML, CSS. So your entire, so this is the snippet that shows the image tag that forms this entire ball, right, inside this entire window. And then what we want to do is to create JavaScript in this orange right here, and said, I'm going to set a timer, and this move ball, which is the asynchronous methods. By the way, there's also the events here too, but we don't use that event, so we don't have to include it. Which means, so what is 10? 10 is 10 milliseconds, okay? So 10 milliseconds is, 1/10, right? Oh, actually 1/1000th of a second. So this happens really fast. So this means every 10, okay, milliseconds, you want to call move ball. So set interval basically means every X amount of milliseconds. And this is going to be called. So basically what this is check the, my left pixel, whatever this is at. I want to move my left pixel by another 5 pixels right here. Okay. And that's going to shift the entire, purple ball to the right side, because +1, positive direction, is on the right, towards the right. So yeah, so after 10 milliseconds, of course, this thing is gonna figure out the location of your purple ball and say, hey, I'm gonna shift it by 5 pixels. So you can kind of see this entire purple ball gets moved, right? All right, so if I were to continue the whole action and just say, hey, let's not stop this and see how it goes, then every 20 milliseconds, what you get is you see this ball shifted by 5 milliseconds, by 5 pixels, and then it does really fast, right? So 20 milliseconds. So how many 20 milliseconds in a second? 50, right? So in 1 second, there's like 50 shift, right? 5 pixels, to the right. That's why you see the entire ball moving so fast. Make sense? So that's set interval in the upshot. In this one example, there's a couple of activities that you should go through, at your own time. Any questions so far? I think we're doing pretty well. Yeah, just I would definitely pay attention to, again, asking you to please go through this entire read and don't miss any of these, okay? Any of these. So there's a couple of deep linking, and like I said, you don't have to go through every single deep link, because some of the deep link takes you into an encyclopedia, and no one's gonna go through that whole encyclopedia. Please get as much as you can out of that deep link content, and maybe earmark it and come back and do some more. Okay, you have the whole week to do this, so please don't try again. I see so many people doing this. Please don't wait till the last minute and just try to complete all of these reading for the sake of getting the points, because there's really no learning after that. So I want you, the more time you spend on going through these, okay, I'm just going to click into one of them, the better it is you're prepared for, okay? There's a lot of very small things that you find out along the way, and then the more of those that you picked up, the easier it is to apply the foundations to make things work, okay, in the future. Because remember, computer science is very applied, okay? There's not a lot of memorizations there. It's all about muscle memory and recognizing patterns and applying these patterns to solve problems, okay? Same thing with JavaScript. All right, cool. So I'm gonna move on to, sorry, did I miss? Yeah, so modifying, yeah, so this is a modifying CSS with JavaScript. So now that you know how to modify HTML with CSS, with JavaScript, right? Now let's look at changing the CSS JavaScript. So yes, you can use JavaScript to change your style as well. And this is a little convoluted, and there's some of the JavaScript methods that you need to know, like get property value, get property, remove properties, and things like that. And I'll get you these. Now I don't do this a lot, just because I don't really play with the front end a lot. I do a lot of back end JavaScript. So this thing is for the node. So let's get into presentation mode. Yeah, the style decoration, properties. Yeah, the very first thing that you see in this participation activity is your inline CSS, right? This entire inline CSS basically paints a rectangular box in green. So your DOM maintains a list of div styles and properties and values. So you can kind of see your element.style. So which element? Your div, okay? So your div is an element. Div.style. Width is this, height is this. So this is all basically when this entire thing gets loaded, your DOM has this array that maintains this list. Okay, so list is the same as array in programming term. And then so far so good. If you do element.style.get property value, okay, in JavaScript, now this entire orange portion is your JavaScript, then you get what's called 100px. Where is that coming from? Well, this one is coming from your width, okay? So imagine this whole elements.style itself is really just an array. And this array has a property associated with it. I'm sorry, this method associated with it called get property value. It's a key value pair inside of it. You can think of it as sort of a dictionary that gets stored inside your DOM, and your JavaScript has access to it. Okay, so this whole thing in orange, this entire list is accessible by your JavaScript through get property value. Okay, so let's look on, and the same thing with get. There's also set. Okay, set means setting the value. Okay, changing the value. Get means read. Okay, so get is read only, set is write. Okay, write. So read and write. Make sense? So set alters the value, whereas get only read the value, okay, from the service with not changing it. So that's that. And then you also have set properties again. Again, you can do other attributes like the background color, and then you can remove the property, meaning that's not even have it. So as you can see, you can programmatically alter the look and feel of your CSS, okay, at runtime. So this is loaded in your browser memory, and it gets executed basically when the page gets rendered, right? Any questions about this PA? All right, so there's document.style sheets, there's CSS rules, there's the insert rules and delete rules. This gets complicated because you can insert a rule into a style sheet. So what is a rule? Well, one of the information example is dot price. This dot price means that this price is what? In terms of CSS, this price is a class, right? So we use a dot operator. So this class price associated with the font weight bold, right? You can set it to some sort of pixels too. This is the rule. This is one example of the rule. So you can use insert rule and delete rule, basically write the whole script of what CSS ought to be from scratch using this entire thing. Instead of, just going by, width equals that, you can insert the entire rule in addition to font weight. You can do background color as well. So you can just keep on concatenating key value pairs into this entire thing and just do a lot of changes in one shot. Make sense? All you need to do is insert rule, or you can change, which means modify it, or you can delete the entire thing. So you can do this programmatically using JavaScript. This is all very front-end-ish. In front-end developments, you do this, but you don't do this in back-end, okay? There is a participation activity. I'm not going to do this with you, but you can change HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and please use the time to get this right. This is where learning takes off, but please don't second guess or try to ChatGPT this entire thing. You got to do it yourself, okay? Based on the information is given. Any questions about this? All right, I don't know if we need to go through this class list yet. This is adding the whole class. This is, I remember when I said element has a class and ID, there's that. So this entire, let me see, entire thing, like this class is error hidden. So you can have this class name, value associated with it, and you can use the, this add and remove, to get rid of an addition or update existing class value. And this actually does a huge amount of change, because every time you modify a whole class, now remember this entire class, just like your ID, could be associated with a CSS rule, and that entire rule has a lot of stuff in it. Okay, so the moment that you get rid of the whole class, this entire element is no longer associated with that class or look and feel. It will be something else completely different. So this is a pretty big change, and I would consider this type of change as a macro type of change, not micro, macro. Okay, macro type of changes, where you effectuate a whole lot of stuff. You can also do toggle too, to make sure that the class is present, and then this other class says no display, or display equals none. This basically makes something that is invisible, something that is visible into invisible, right? So all of a sudden, when something happens, you effectuate this toggle, and through this class swap, you can get rid of the whole frame by hiding it, or you can change its z-axis. So those of you who came from an HTML CSS class knows what I'm talking about. If not, yeah, you gotta go study CSS style sheets, okay? And the good news is, if you're using this Zybook, I'm gonna tell you right now, the class predate this 193 class. It's all about here to here. So you want to revisit these two, okay? In particular, more CSS. And CSS Fundamental will tell you more about those. Any questions so far? All right. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to rush this, but yeah, there's just not a lot to talk about in CSS with JavaScript, but there's a lot to talk about in data validations. So this is a form, and you see this a lot, where you can create HTML with some sort of form in it. And so form starts from here to here. So you guys know what a form is, right? It's some sort of text entry with some labels next to it, like username and password, okay, login box. And usually this form comes with some sort of submission button. And whatever this one is, this one has the accept disclaimer or something like that, where you have to, which is a checkbox. But a form is basically this whole area, plus these bells and whistles, right? This thing you can enter or not. But the most important part is the form has a submit button. So this submit button usually is this, okay? So a lot of times people do this. There's a submit type. The other thing you can do is, if you don't want this input, you can just create a button, and that button has a type submit, and it'll kind of be similar, but it's kind of the pain, because you have to enable form submission on that button. which means you have to tie an event, like click event, right? It's a lot of work. So you might as well just use the input type, type submit, right? This entire submit gives you the native look and feel of that submission button. And then you can decide to style this, right? So it doesn't look this ugly right here. You can make it into a round, super big, with some gold glittering, you know, whatever. And when people press on it and you see the fireworks going, you can go crazy with that. But anyway, so what we're looking at is a form input with a embedded, okay, this is an inline JavaScript, okay. This inline JavaScript, hold on a second, let me see. Yeah, this is, so I think what we're doing is form validations here. And hold on, let's do this again. Okay, it looks like user just types in some stuff. All right, so far so good. There's nothing about JavaScript. So when user clicks on the submission button, so what gets submitted is the text fields, right? Whatever gets entered as part of the form input, okay? Not label. Label is just a read-only, you know, banner. It's whatever's inside these input boxes. So there are two input boxes right here. Actually, yes, there's another one here. So that's why you see these two red one to highlight. But they're invalid because you didn't do anything with it. And how do we do that? This invalid is being validated through validate.js. And where's validate.js? Validate.js was inlined here, right? So remember, when your entire form is rendered, your JavaScript would have been loaded. So assuming this entire JavaScript loads really fast, okay? Sometimes this JavaScript is like 3,000 miles away. It takes like 2 seconds to load. And by the time, you know, you have the form rendered, the user clicks on it right away, JavaScript hasn't been loaded. And that's a glitch right here, right? So usually you don't want to display something when JavaScript is there. But anyway, we're assuming that JavaScript is already there in memory, loaded, lock and loaded, and you're able to, the user is able to enter something and then hit submit, right? So at this junction, whatever gets entered has to be validated through this JavaScript URL, JavaScript code. So let's look at what happens. All right, submission, and then boom. Yeah, if this is all correct, the user goes back and modify these things. Now, in this entire form validation examples here, we don't see JavaScript, but you can trust that this validate.javascript actually looks into this entire input right here, and also this entire input right here. And the way that it could do it is because there's an ID associated with it, right? So you use pound cart number and pound accept terms. Your entire JavaScript is going to just pull that into the whole input out, and then, you know, probably perform some sort of there's a event handling there that ties these elements with a JavaScript event listener. This listener is gonna call the function with the event parameters there that does the event that target that value, right? That's the user entry text that we talked about earlier, like half an hour ago. And does the validation. If everything passes, then yes, submission goes through. So there's quite a bit of JavaScript that's gets involved behind the scene here, but this one doesn't really show. Make sense? All right. So I think we kind of talked about this value, which is really the element.target.value. This is input value has a value. So this value is the actual user enter text. Okay. So when you enter something, you're entering something through whatever is available on your keyboard, right? Those are user entered text. These are characters, chars, okay, that represents in an ASCII table. So these user entered text is available through this value property. Okay, inside what? Inside your target. Okay, and this target is inside what? Inside your event. But ultimately, what's inside of this input element is that user entered text. So this value is associated with that input element. So yes, just remember there is a value attribute associated with that input element anywhere. There's also checked. So checked is a default property that gives you either true or false when a check box like this is either checked or not. Okay, so if the user click on it, that entire checkbox is going to have a property called checked that's going to return truthy. Okay, not falsy, truthy. So if not, then this checkbox will be by default null, right? There's no value associated with this, or empty. And check is going to be falsy in that case. Make sense? All right, let me see how much is there. There's quite a bit of form that we're gonna look at. Let's let's play this one. Yeah, so this is a snippet of this whole input box right here. There's no form. Okay, we want to we want to perform validation. So yeah, in this case we have JavaScript. In this JavaScript is not in orange anymore. It's in blue. It's saying I'm gonna get the error message sales price right here as an object, and then I want to, you know, when you have, next time when you see error message dot inner HTML, this is the user text right here. The whatever's inside the you know, the text embedded by the HTML elements. So sales price widget, there are two widgets here. One of them is the error widget, and the other one is the price widget. If inside the price widget, its value is, you know, it's basically 0. And in JavaScript, you can use the deep comparisons equals 0 to say, hey, this is absolutely 0. There's nothing in there. Then you want to say sales price is missing, okay? Because there's nothing here. And if not, you can check to see if this is not a number. It's not a number, is a default JavaScript. I think it's a text method. I'll check to see if this is you know, is not a number or not. You can also use triple equals to is NaN. Okay, it's the same thing. Instead of using this, but yeah, if not, then you want to set this inner.html, which gets displayed as HTML text when this entire HTML gets rendered. You want to say please enter a number, so on and so forth. But anyway, let's look at this. The second frame says the price is missing. Yes, the reason is because there's nothing in there, right? And you use this code that we discussed. Okay, so next up is you're gonna enter dog. So this dog is not a number, but it's also not empty, so this one gets triggered. Okay, actually though, this is enter a number. Hold on a second. Yeah, as long as this is not a number, which is dog is not a number, then you're gonna see please enter a number. All right, so next up is you're gonna enter a number. So this entire thing gets checked, right? From if to else if, eventually to let. It sales price parse in. So you're gonna enter, so you're gonna parse that value 9 into a string. Actually no, into an integer. So what you can do is you can use a parse float or parse integer in JavaScript to get the value out of it, because the value by default is actually a string. And then you can compare the arithmetic. Doing sales price is less than, you know, 10 or greater than 1,000, and you you know, that you enter this must be between whatever inside the, you know, HTML called inner.html. All right, any questions about this? All right, just very quickly, these are PAs. I don't see any additional. Yes, so you would see this thing as required. This one is used a lot in a form where, let's say, for example, you want to make this entire screen name to be required field, like using a password, right? Both of them have to be required if you want to log in. So you actually have this required field inside your HTML. And I think the example, this one doesn't show, but let's say if this one has to be required. Oh, actually this does. So you'll have the require right before the end of that element. Okay, you will literally just write out required. So if you don't enter that, you will not be able to submit. Okay, so that required field, let's just say screen name is required. This one has to have some text entries inside to enable the submit. Okay, So it's very possible to have multiple required fields just like that. Now this avoids having to write any JavaScripts at all. Okay, so this requires already kind of baked in your HTML DOM, and your HTML DOM has a list of JavaScript properties and behavior that it governs and require actually triggers some behind the scene checking of the required field, making sure that field is not empty or null. All right, same thing with the maximum minimum. You can enable this, the value check. You can set, hey, the maximum value in this particular field is 10. So you cannot have more than, any number that's greater than 10. You can set the minimum length of your password has to be 10. Maximum is 16. So you guys see that before, right? Some typical login, stipulations. Some of the stipulations are really silly. Like your last name has to have at least 3 characters. And, like if you're Asian, like my name has 2 characters. So I can tell you the true story is it took me literally a month to log into a utility website because that website says your last name has to be at least 3 characters. And guess what? I wasn't able to get in for a month until the software engineer figured this out. So what a silly requirements, right? And yes, and you can do this. You can do this all in JavaScript inside your HTML. All right, so any questions? Oh, you see this very interesting thing. What is this? This is regular expression. All right. Not going to learn this. There's a lot of stuff here. Regular expression means it's pattern recognition and saying, hey, this pattern, if, in this case, this tilde sign means not. This D means, I believe, it's a digit. Yes, digit. And there must be at least 16 of them, or at the most 16 of them. And then this I don't know, this dollar sign means I think it's all the way through or something like that. Yeah, I have to go back and check. But anyways, this is not regex class. But you can impose regular expressions, right, on this particular input type. Okay. And yeah, you can do a lot of stuff with it. So this is a very useful shorthand for writing JavaScript without writing JavaScript. Okay, so you can enable these behaviors without writing JavaScript, but natively, what enables these behaviors is JavaScript, right? But your browser made it so that you only have to code, these keywords that enables a string of things in JavaScript. Anyway, so you can look at the examples in the reference book that talks about these. Yeah, same thing with this too. You can kind of look at it. I think what gets complicated is when you have pseudo classes where, yeah, these things you can set input is invalid. Then if this is invalid, then use this, right? If this color, if this input is valid, then you use this. So you can do this level of quote unquote JavaScript with CSS to enable the look and feel of your pseudo class. Okay, pseudo class means it's not really a class, but it acts like a class. Because what you're doing is when this input, right, you don't say class and what happens when this happens and this class needs to have this and this. You simply just attach invalid keyword with this colon sign or a valid keyword with this colon sign. If this input is valid, then the background color has to be this. If this input is not valid, then you change it. Okay. So yeah, in addition to validations, you also have changes that is associated with the wrong input versus good input. So one example is this, right? When you key in some date of birth and this YYYY is like 3000, and we're not at 3000, right? It'll give you this red background, right, to tell you, hey, this is something wrong, please do it again. And this entire box shakes, right? You can do all that in JavaScript, okay? And then I'll leave you to figuring out how to make the whole box shakes for a while, right? So yeah, so you can do a lot of that stuff. This is just a high level overview of what you can do with JavaScript. Any questions so far? All right. This is lightweight, only a couple minutes. I think we can end today's with this topic. So I'm very glad we don't have to change anything here. Sometimes I have to adjust the cadence. So JavaScript Object Notation, I think I alluded to this one a few times this semester. So this thing is short for JSON, okay? JavaScript Object Notation is JSON. This thing came about maybe 2008 or 2009 or so when this came out. It became instant success. Everybody loves it because if you look at the entire JSON, what does this remind you of? This entire thing in blue. This is JavaScript object, right? JavaScript object uses what? This curly braces, right? And then you can see JavaScript object. But what about this? This key value right here. Well, this key value is kind of like a map, right? Yes, it is a map. And this map is a key and a value. So what about this value? What does this value remind you of? Like right here. It uses bracket, right? So it looks like
an array.
Oh yeah, this is an array. So this array has what? Another object inside of it. And this object is actually a map, right? So you have this object inside, you have this object containing array of map of other objects of other arrays. So you can mix and match basically this whole thing because you can put basically anything inside an object. So object is just generic wrapper that has stuff in it, right? So this stuff could be, like 3,000 nested arrays inside of it. It could be a whole bunch of map, key value pairs, dictionary, whatever you have. You can just kind of strew together. And this looks just like a Java object of sorts. That's what JSON is. Now, if you were to express the entire JSON and have it consumed at runtime by JavaScript, guess what happens? They become JavaScript objects, okay? And vice versa. So when you consume JSON, so what JSON is a text, okay, into JavaScript object, which is in binary, right? That's what we call serialization, okay? This is actually a term in computer science. You serialize something, means you convert text into binary. You deserialize it is the opposite side, right? Approach where you would, unfold what's inside the binary into text. So serialization and deserialization in JavaScript using JSON, extremely efficient. And because it is efficient, it's very fast. And because it is fast, it consumes less memory. And because it is so easy to do that, and people can just write JSON value and convert it into JavaScript and make it interoperable, they can be worked into HTML. It can be worked into CSS very easily. And it's much, much more portable than other data format, such as what? XML, right? People use XML to write. Why would you want to write a huge XML with so many different tags, values, attributes, and create an XML parser to consume it? Instead, you could have used JSON. And this is the reason JSON took flight and it became instant success. Make sense? So this is what JSON value is. And then you have JSON object, of course. You have what's called JSON.stringify. This creates a string. So believe it or not, JSON is not about converting into JavaScript object or vice versa. You can stringify. You can actually transform your entire JSON into a string. And this is an example of what you can do. Like, let me see, string. Yeah, this entire JSON. It takes a JSON object. You can actually output this whole thing, and it will stringify this whole thing for you. In plain text. Okay, so a lot of times you can have key value pairs inside of it, and you stringify it to, to do a login, for example. And everything that gets passed in is a whole bunch of JavaScript JSON objects. And you can, due to its interoperable properties, you can traverse back and forth, basically. You can also stringify and transform them into a string where you can just console log it, right? For logging purposes, for audit, for reporting, and things like that. Now, I've never used Reviver myself, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. The Reviver function is used to modify parse value before being returned, and is helpful when a JSON string represents a data type that's not available in JSON. Yeah, I think this is the specialized, one of the approaches in what you can do with JSON. Let me see. Yeah, this whole JSON field is really straightforward to understand. There's not a lot of tricks. If I were to exit the presentation view, you can kind of see a lot more context. And I think the best way to go about it is, just use the MDM. And there's only 2 methods here. Yes, this is it. Go to W3 School. W3 School has a much better representation of JSON with lots of examples. So this MDM web doc is more for like professionals, and they've already had some experiences with JSON. They just want to look at some of the, maybe take a deeper dive into the official documentation. And what you see here is the official documentation. There's not a lot of examples. W3 School has a whole lot of them there, okay?